Mouthwashing begins by starting you off in a cockpit. The ship you're flying is a long-haul space freighter named the Tulpar. Currently, it needs to steer out of the way of a nearby asteroid. But instead of doing that, you crash right into it. The next couple of minutes revolve around you walking down impossible hallways. They are designed to slowly unnerve you as you try to find a way out, until it finally hits you with a jump scare. Oh my god! What a banger ass entrance. Mouthwashing's opening is a symbol of how I view the game as a whole, I think. I felt like its writing was absolutely beautiful, and very clearly written, with a passion that betrays a honed talent. Though on that same token, I feel like it tried too hard to scare me with vague symbolism that never really made sense to me in the moment. That is ultimately how I viewed Mouthwashing. Great after the fact, but confusing in the moment. I played through Mouthwashing twice. The first time on December 6th of last year, and then January 22nd of this year. What happened between those two playthroughs was the writing for this video. After my first playthrough, I found myself unsure of what to feel or even what it was really trying to convey to me. Once I had started the writing for this video, I had discovered so much more than what I had initially learned from the game's runtime, almost as if I had discovered a new game. So I rewrote the script for this numerous times, crafting what I believe to be carefully thought out positions in one breath, only to discard it with a brand new piece of evidence that proved my arguments unfounded every single time. I'd done this so many times that eventually it landed me on a second playthrough. I felt like I was getting gaslit a little bit because I've never struggled so hard putting thought to paper after playing a game. That happening to me, I think, was a good enough reason as any to take a second evaluation at the game and have a look at why it lost me in the first place. More importantly, it was to find out if I was fit to even criticize the game at all. I think that after my second evaluation, I don't think I'm fit at all. I understand that it takes a lot of artistry to seriously be able to horrify people and tell a compelling story at the same time. Although on that same token, I think that this genre is very fickle, and because of that, I think artists get lost in trying too hard. When really, the greatest aspects of the game are the things that come effortlessly. I enjoyed Mouthwashing to the point where I think it's good enough to sit up there with the greats of its genre. However, personally, I felt like coming away from it, despite the fact that I overall enjoyed what it had to offer, I wasn't left with an impression that would stay with me for very long. My number one goal for this video is to adequately demonstrate why I misunderstood this game on my first playthrough, and then explain to you how it affected my experience. I aim to do that by taking you through the game piece by piece, until the penultimate moment that lost me. On the way there might be some slight diversions as I discuss the game's structure, its symbolism, and its intricacies in its writing. For now... Oh, fuck.
And my game crashed.
Oh, shit. This is Anya, Swansea, Daisuke, and Jimmy. These are the remaining crew members of the Tulpar. Anya is the crew's calm and friendly nurse. Swansea is the abrasive engineer. Daisuke is the cheery intern. And Jimmy is the co-captain. Now captain, after the fifth character, Curly, crashed the ship and almost got himself killed. These characters are introduced pretty well. You get a sense about what each individual is about without a lengthy explanation. The first segment is really just about getting a feel for the setting and the characters involved. Daisuke is mostly supposed to be a foil for Swansea, and he has some genuine insight about him that proves he's not as dim as he might seem. Talking to Swansea, we find that he's guarding the door for the engineering bay, telling us that it's just a wall of foam. Funnily enough, it's also the only room that has life pods in it. It's quite obvious from the beginning that there isn't actually a wall of foam there, and the way he talks to Jimmy feels like it's trying to cement him as the old dog with a spiky exterior. Anya is usually the one to take care of Curly, but she just can't seem to do it at the moment. She means well in the end, and the situation around her might just be getting to her in a way we can't see yet. This chapter ends with us eventually going to the cockpit, retrieving the code scanner, and opening the cargo bay to see if there are any supplies worth using. It's pretty routine character development. It's all done really well, and it does a great job at setting up the elements for the story later. Here is where we get to see the dynamics of each crewmate with each other, including an introduction to the captain who crashed the ship, Curly. But before we jump into that, I'd like to discuss an aspect of this game that makes it so brilliant in the first place. Mouthwashing opts to tell its story out of sequence. It's very familiar to Pulp Fiction, as the same can be said about how it tells its story, jumping to different moments in time that show events happening out of order. However, here, it seems to be used as a way to inform the events that are happening in front of you. For example, it uses 2 months after the crash to introduce you to the setting and let you get comfortable. Then it will jump back in time to give you context about what happened before the crash. This is a seriously interesting way to tell a story, and it's done ingeniously. The problem with Pulp Fiction is how its story is hard to follow. It's almost confusing as events happen in seemingly random order, and because of that, it's difficult to discern what it might be trying to say, and sometimes what is even happening. Even today, no one is certain of why it's told this way, and I think that while it's cool for community discussion, I don't think it's great for conveying what the movie was actually about. For Mouthwashing, the reason is self-evident, and I think that it nails it up until the last 30% of the game. Events prior to the crash inform and recontextualize scenes that happen after it. You're supposed to be piecing together small clues that point you towards the greater answer. The events before the crash always move forward, not bouncing around in the middle of the week. And it's the same for after the crash. It moves up from 2 to 3, 4, and then 5 months after it. So it always feels like the story is being conveyed to you in a way that makes sense, while also still technically telling it out of order. It does really well to make sure that it's not really confusing in any way, as it's pretty hard to misinterpret what's happening in the events unfolding. Anyway, Curly is a seemingly friendly and capable captain with an amicable relationship with the people around him. Everything a captain should be. The crew are in the middle of performing psych evals. As Curly finishes his, it's noted that he gave the same answers as his previous one, as well as the fact that he can't sleep. This may be an indication about his mental state. Eventually, they discuss Jimmy's psych eval, which Anya notes as being frustrating because he doesn't take it seriously. Curly offers to do it instead, giving us our objective for the day. We're met with Jimmy downstairs in front of the engineering bay.
And Pony Express said they don't provide on-board entertainment.
Swansea and Daisuke are having problems with the vent that leads into medbay. After we sort it out, we head to the cockpit. Wait. Oh, okay. This character is mentally ill. At the end of the psych eval, we find that Pony Express, the company that owns the Tulpa, has delivered a message. As Jimmy leaves the room, we get a glimpse at a letter in our inventory. After all, we jump back 2 months after the crash, where we find that the cargo is absolutely filled to the brim with mouthwash. It's not clear initially what the point of the mouthwash is even for and why it's being transported in the first place. It's not food, which sucks for the crew, but it doesn't feel like it has much relevance to the story up until this point. The crew slowly starts to break down, but before we get to think about it for long, we're thrown back again 6 days before the crash. Oh. Oh shit. The objective, break the news, is listed at the top of the screen. I need to tell them, Curly states, as he walks up the stairs into the lounge. Oh! We're met with a surprise!
Jesus. Birthday parties scare me, I don't fucking do them.
The crew's communal birthday has fallen upon the captain. We can have a cheeky little bit of fun with some mates, enjoy some lovely words with the crew, and then bake a delectable cake. Instead of a nice speech, however, Curly breaks the news to the crew. Pony Express has kicked the bucket, leading to the eventual end of employment for the crew. Dread hangs over the crew now, as their prospects for a life after the Tulpar's final voyage are quite dim at best. Mouthwashing's second greatest aspect is right in front of us. Deriving meaning from the events that happen across the game can be seriously satisfying and enjoyable when done correctly. Initially, I found myself asking what's the point of the mouthwash. The scene after this is supposed to define the purpose of its existence in the narrative, to cement the theme that all this strife and pain meant nothing. All of the actions and reactions to events happening on the Tulpar did not need to happen. This product was not worth shipping, let alone consuming, but in the end, the lives of 5 different people were risked over its delivery. Such an incredibly simple and poignant message delivered with masterful narrative work. It's 4 months after the crash. This is the aftermath of finding the mouthwash. The crew is tired and sick, seemingly lost in the infinite reaches of space with no help in sight. Daisuke has a beautiful little moment, only a couple meters away from the cargo. Mouthwashing's little interactions are most likely what makes these characters so likeable, as they're widely applicable and understandable most of the time. While they might be kind of stereotypes, there's always another layer of complexity which can bear out in conversations like this. This moment is both parts beautiful as it is gut-wrenching, as I think on the whole, this is what makes psych horror so great. These small interactions I feel are so much more meaningful and terrifying in a sense than any monster or atmosphere can really ever make me. I think there's a very thick barrier that sits in between what's conventionally scary versus what's actually horrifying. I feel like it's so much easier to penetrate that barrier when the writing gets personal. That's why it feels a lot more impactful when he says, "I hope she doesn't blame herself." There are plenty more moments in Mouthwashing like this that aim to illuminate the character's thoughts and feelings in a way that adds nuance to their character, and they are, in my opinion, the best parts of the game because they are incredibly compelling and well written. I've been hinting throughout the whole video about the problems I've had with mouthwashing up until this point. Here's where we begin to break down those problems, beginning with the last 30% of the game. This is Judgment, a third set of events in the story of the Tulpa, and it breaks the rules previously established with the majority of its scenes, and because of that, instead of being an interesting diversion, it becomes a confusing distraction. I think ultimately the game pays the price for the way it executes these scenes. Rob your fucking life, you piece of shit. Oh god. Because it's at this point the game starts to lose me. This moment doesn't feel like it does much to help or bolster up much of anything happening in the narrative, and only really confuses and overwhelms me with an event that is supposedly trying to convey something to me. It can't even lay out its whole hand on the table, because if you go into your inventory, the one item that would at least illuminate what's happening is blurred out with static, although it won't be hard to tell in a few moments. Judgment connects directly to the final month, and while it does become evident later what's happening, it's too confusing in the moment to justify its placement. I think that throwing the end of the game in my face while I'm still figuring out what happened prior to that moment was not the smartest move narratively, because there isn't even really much to tell. What I'm trying to say is that while Judgment has some great moments of character building and gameplay, I think it's treading water, as it's not really doing anything for the game other than padding out its runtime. I don't think it's necessarily irrelevant to the story, I just think it's irrelevant to what's happening now. I'll admit to you now that I haven't been showing these events in any particular order. It's more for how I wanted to structure my piece, and because of that, there have been bits and pieces that have happened that I did have an issue with, but I found it a little inappropriate to talk about them right in the middle of an event or a scene, so I've decided to throw all of them at you at once. It's hard not to think about what psych horror is trying to tell you. Sometimes it can become an obsession, where you start to see shadows where there aren't really any. I feel like mouthwashing can sometimes be the opposite, where I feel like the light itself can become meaningless. There are a number of hallucinations and dreams in this game that objectively do have some sort of symbolism that it's trying to reference to you, but whether it be placement in the narrative, or prioritization of gameplay mechanics, or a general vagueness to them, they tend to fly straight over my head. 7 days before the crash, Curly discusses in the conversation with Jimmy that he feels like he's on the highest rung of the corporate ladder, and how that scares him. That's fine character development, and it's a great aspect to the character. What I find so confusing about it is that we're confronted with the symbolism of broken and bent ladders before we even learn about what it means. This led me to completely miss what any of this meant, and I still don't know how this is relevant not only to Curly, but to the story either. The next biggest piece is the survival sections. Mouthwashing has really cool gameplay ideas that are fun on a first try but feel very boring and almost irrelevant to the narrative at play. Sometimes if you spend too long on them the first time, they can become tedious to you in the moment. The invisible horse maze is introduced with a tombstone. It asks you to turn the scanner on, only to find that once you do, the tombstone and the wall behind it disappears, leading you down a seemingly infinite staircase with a large open space in front of you. After climbing down the staircase for long enough, a black screen informs you that you... Be quiet, dude. In this area there is an invisible threat that will kill you and force you to restart the maze. It looks like a horse with a rotted face and a long neck. After completing the maze, you're sent back to a moment that we can't talk about yet. The majority of the joy I get from playing these games is digging into its themes and events within the narrative to unearth some greater symbolism about the environment, the characters, and the story as a whole. One of the biggest reasons for my misunderstanding is how it does half its symbolism. Mouthwashing has some excellent moments of great symbolism, and it has a good number of events in this game that feel vague, to the point where anything could be recently applied to it and it would map on 100%. I find that to be quite unsatisfying. 5 different moments throughout this game miffed me, and funny enough, they feel unimportant to the wider narrative, as without their inclusion, the game actually becomes far easier to understand. The invisible horse is one event that I think can reasonably be applied to anything, and because of that I feel it's unnecessary. Anything that it might attempt to symbolize, being that it's an invisible threat that you have to be quiet around, its position in the story, or even who was having the hallucination, can theoretically be applied to multiple different points in the game's story. Hallucinations are another big one that I feel could be removed from my experience and I would feel no different. Usually, some sort of mirror dimension in psych horror is used to represent aspects of the real world and symbolize the themes that are present to the game at hand. Silent Hill's Otherworld and Amori's Otherworld are representative of themes and story that happen in the overworld. In a sense, you can say that one informs the other. Instead, for Mouthwashing, I felt that a large amount of the hallucinations reflect aspects or themes from the normal story, in a way that doesn't really feel like it's saying anything. I don't know what relevance this part has to its story or what I'm even trying to accomplish. There are no explanations on its mechanics, and it's failable for some reason. I spent 10 minutes doing this bit over and over, until eventually I completed it on accident. And again, it's hard to relate this to anything, to the point where it can be applied to anything and everything. After that hectic moment, we are met with the serene blue of the night sky. It's a moment shared between Anya and Curly about how different their perspectives are. Anya notices a dead pixel on the upper right hand corner, while Curly states that he never noticed it. This is supposed to illuminate their contrasting outlook on their situation. Anya chooses to focus on the smallest detail, while Curly likes to look at the bigger picture. This is followed up with a question about the locks on the doors. The game, from the very beginning, is asking the question, why would Curly crash the ship? To truly find out why that would be, we jump between time periods before and after the ship crashes. This can be hours, days, and months before or after. A few key events are meant to paint a picture of why it happened. The implication that his mental state might not be where he says it is can be one indication of that. The disbanding of the company they work for is another, as essentially no one except Curly has the prospects to work anywhere else. Information is slowly given to you to the point where, even with all the possible events that happen to Curly, there just isn't a good enough reason here to justify crashing the ship. The actual point is not to cast a light on Curly's situation, as if we take a look at his prospects, he's actually well off. It's all a redirect. What we're supposed to be looking at is where it puts Jimmy, in conjunction with his situation with Anya. For this one, we're going to have to take a step back to fully paint the picture of what I'm going for. I found Jimmy to be a character I didn't really understand the first time around. He feels like he has the least amount of dialogue in the entire game, but I don't really think that's true. Though it feels that way because I think a lot of what he says is functional. He initiates conversation with everyone else in the crew, responding to what everyone else says, and because of that, I thought that I didn't really know much of what he feels or thinks at first, and the dream sequences, as I've established, feel too vague to discern any meaningful insight. There are only a couple of short moments of character building for Jimmy, and while they are integral to understanding the character, because they are so limited, it makes it a little hard to fully understand what he's about. The key to understanding the character is his actions and how he treats the people around him, as well as the small hints through subtext that are laid out in his own as well as everyone else's dialogue. Jimmy has a swath of moments that define him, and to some extent attempt to redeem him, but to fully understand them, I'm going to have to go through the game again from the beginning. Anya states that I have to make a report with things like, I have found myself sexually excited at the sight of cartoon horses. A harmless act, but it's supposed to establish that his place as somewhat of a tough person to talk to. When Jimmy actually gets his psych eval, it's revealed that he was struggling on Earth, and that he likes being in control, but that's essentially it. It's a great moment of perspective, not just for Jimmy but for Curly too. It's announced to the crew that the Pony Express is finally shutting down. Jimmy's reaction is quite hateful.
You are so fucking hateful.
Taking the things he said and twisting them in a way that frames Curly as the bad guy, in a way that's supposed to imply that he somehow did this maliciously. A reoccurring pattern with Jimmy is that he tends to assume the worst in the people around him, even if they're good friends to him. Oh god, how cynical is this? It's late. Curly is wailing in the middle of the night. It's uncertain if Anya has given him his pain meds, so Jimmy goes to find her, only to discover that Swansea and Anya are talking in the cockpit. Jimmy goes back upstairs to feed Curly his meds, but not before he gets to say his piece. Two narratives are being played side by side along the entirety of the game. The idea that Curly was the one that crashed the ship, and the emerging question of what Jimmy did. By presenting these two side by side, we begin to speculate about what happened and how it affected the crew, but we'll never know enough to make assertions or guesses. We can only see what he does next. This is the last semblance of normalcy you'll ever see. There isn't much that happens during this event, it's more about what happens when Anya asks for Jimmy to give Curly his meds. Oh my god, what the fuck are you doing there? Jesus Christ. The way Jimmy talks to Anya aims to demoralize her. It's already been established that he will openly mock Anya's medical abilities, and this is only another example in the many presented throughout the game that Jimmy does not respect Anya. Only one thing is made clear throughout this section. Find the gun.
Whoa!
A frightening sight. As Curly, we rush through every hallway into every room, looking at every corner until finally, we walk into the cockpit. Anya is kneeling on the floor. Curly opens the conversation. I think we already know what the assumption is, and it's certainly not a good one. We rush down to the cockpit. When we get there, we hit the catalyst for this game's story.
What?
This very moment is when the themes and the meaning of the story come into full play. This is also my ultimate misunderstanding with the game as a whole.
Mouthwashing is a story about two men and how their actions affect not just themselves but the wider crew at large. Jimmy and Curly are those two men. Curly is the stand-up leader, good at his job, that people genuinely seem to like. Jimmy wants to be like Curly, but his insecurities don't really allow for it, meaning he only really acts in a way that he thinks Curly would act to the people around him. But instead of being caring and genuine, his resentment and hatred impact his actions in a really twisted way.
Because of this, the story seems to shine a lot of light on Jimmy's actions and how his cowardice and twisted view of responsibility seem to be the only things standing between life after the Tolpa and imminent death. I believe that the catalyst for my misunderstanding of this game was this moment before Jimmy crashes the ship. This scene lost me, but not because I misunderstood what Jimmy's character was about.
Even if I had somehow missed a couple of lines of dialogue, the narrative points to so many faults in Jimmy's behaviour that it's understandable why he crashed the ship. In fact, I think I can empathise with his position.
It's actually Curly's behaviour and actions that caused the big misunderstanding for this entire game. Everything I assumed about Jimmy, the limited dialogue, vague dreams, and psychosis is actually true of Curly. Curly gets the least amount of dialogue in the whole game. That's not because of how the character works, it's because for a majority of the game, he physically can't talk.
This makes it tougher to fully paint a picture about who he is and what he's about. The key aspects of this conversation to take away are that Jimmy is suggesting that he crashes the ship because his fuck-ups and mistakes are in his eyes too egregious to realistically escape from. All of the problems he faces in that moment wash away, and he gets to essentially abstain from the responsibility of what he did to Anya and the misery that is life after the Tulpa. In an act of what I can only rationally explain as some sort of lapse of judgment or misunderstanding, Curly agrees, causing Jimmy to walk inside the cockpit, steer the Tulpa directly into the asteroid, and walk out, all without pushback. Not because Curly was dead or incapacitated, he, in so many words, turned a blind eye.
My suspension of disbelief refuses to acknowledge that Curly essentially let him do this. This is the catalyst for the entire game. Curly, the responsible Tulpa pilot, lets Jimmy take the entire crew down because of something that Jimmy did himself. That was my core misunderstanding with the game. Not that Jimmy did it, it was that Curly let him do it. I believe that there isn't a degree of separation from Jimmy's actions versus Curly's inaction. Unfortunately, even after all the filibustering...
Is the filibuster over yet?
There is an angle that leaves my argument completely unfounded.
Curly's role in the story of Two Men is ultimately a failure of responsibility, impacted by his relationship with Jimmy that leads to the death of the entire crew at his own hands. I said at the start of this video that I'm not fit to criticize Mouthwashing's story, and I think that's because my misunderstanding comes from not fully reading the text in front of me. There is another layer to Curly's character that didn't occur to me the first time I played it. It's implied here that Curly has been silently turning a blind eye to Jimmy's horrid actions, and therefore Curly becomes implicitly responsible for his actions as Jimmy is a danger to the crew. I missed this on my first playthrough and the implications that were behind it.
In the moment is a phrase I've been using a lot. It's meant to represent my greatest issue with the game. The fact that I didn't understand what was happening as the story was unfolding. Mouthwashing is a really tight-knit story, with some really talented writing and a very intentional use of social implication, to give you a little bit more to think about while you're playing. This singular piece of story is crucial to understanding the entire point of the game, but instead of realizing that, I skimmed over it, therefore ruining my entire first playthrough. Which is why my biggest gripe, I think, still stands after everything that's happened. Mouthwashing is a subtle game. You must be careful, fully aware of what people are saying and what the implications of what they're saying change the events and the morality of every single person. Curly had a moment of weakness, but in that same moment, he realized how wrong he was and he took responsibility. Curly being in this state is a poignant and permanent reminder that, in the end, Curly took responsibility, compared to Jimmy, who is in turn directly responsible for him being in this state. When the cards are laid out on the table, I found that Mouthwashing was a beautiful game that I still more than recommend, because despite my experience with the game, I genuinely did enjoy what it had to offer. However, in the moment, I believe it failed to keep me in the loop, leading to confusion to the point where I felt like I never really had the full picture.